vibrate if it wasn't already.
Great. I got mine on airplane mode.
On airplane mode.
Yeah, so nobody calls, nothing, right?
Full send.
All right. Unconventional.
Yeah.
Talk to me, Richie.
The start of the question was, why do you start? On the spectrum of training methodology,
Okay.
you have conventional to unconventional or less, and getting to work with some of your people and to coach them here and there. Like, you start on this end, and then you work back that way when you have to. Is how it seems.
Okay. What do you mean by conventional versus unconventional? Let's go ahead and start there. Do describe it. So something that's like not conventional and then something that is conventional.
So
right?
like I asked you, we were talking about front squats or squatting strength generally, and I said, I am having this problem.
Yep.
And you gave me like 4 options.
Okay.
And you said, well, you could do, like a 1 1/4 squat, or you could do this with a tempo and a pause, and then you could do this, and then, or you could start on the box safety bar. And you kind of worked it in that progression. I feel like seeing your folks, you tend to start on that side. That also might just be my impression.
So like a conventional thing would be, so like, for example, in a front squat, we're like, okay, we're having like trouble in a front squat. So we're going to change the tempo. We're going to change we're going to do a change of variation as opposed to a conventional approach, which would be what? Like just continue to front squat? Or like, I guess, how would you describe that?
I guess it was the choice of variations, I think. Because when you said, in the example that you gave, we started, you could do like a 1 1/4 front squat, and then it was a tempo, and that, we're still front squatting, and then you introduced the box and the deload from the box, which I thought was interesting, versus like in a tempo, you'd be under tension the whole time.
Correct.
Right.
Right.
And then the way that you talk about someone's hip moving and changing position in the middle of the squat is not the way that it is typically described in the rest of the building. Like, nobody else talks about it that way.
So when you go to organize a training system, right? So like the goal is, 1, to have a system, right? And then right. So that's number 1. It's like, how do you make sense of like the chaos of what's out there? And you have to introduce some concepts, and then you have to have some sort of model to work off of. And so in this one example here, right, we have a concept where we can organize things by like a limb arc, essentially. So like if you have this arc, and it's hard to describe, and it's a 3-dimensional thing, so it's not a 2-dimensional thing, but if you just have an arc, right, you have the top portion of your squat, which is going to carry certain movement biases and concepts. You have the middle of a squat, which is going to change those. Then you have the bottom of a squat. So the internal and external rotation of your hips, of your body, your hands, your everything, it all influences it, right? So the limb arc model, if you just raise your hand from like down by your side all the way to above, you need certain levels of rotation, both internally and externally, in order to move into those spaces, right? So that is the thought process. So when you say, I have trouble in the middle part of my squat, right? So like, and it also introduces the concept of relative motion. So when you go to squat down, we all look at bones, where it's like the femur needs to move like up, right? Like I need to flex my femur, right? Like I need to flex my hip, right? So, but then we don't fully appreciate as much from like a traditional sense, like when I learned it, where it's like the hip bone has to move on the femur relatively to the femur, right? So like they have to move like in sync, right? So the hip moves on the femur while the femur moves in the hip. So there's a lot more relative motion there than we're like taught at first, right? So like when you go to school, you're like, the hip can flex from 0 degrees all the way, like to 120, right? or
Sure.
so, right?
Whatever
Like
that
that's
number is.
right. So that's normal, right? But then you're like, well, like in order for it to get there, you have to have the relative motion backward of the hip bone, but then it also has turn like in and out, right? So it has to move in all three planes in order to accomplish that. So if you're saying I have a hard time in the middle of my squat, that's where the internal rotation occurs, right? So like
Right.
during the
Because it.
first, well, right, yeah, right. So the first, like it has to kind of move out, right, and like moves back a little bit, right, like as you go from the top of the squat to the first sort of 60 degrees, and then in that middle range, kind of depending on everybody, it has to tip and it has to rotate, okay, as well as to kind of like tip over and forward, and then in the bottom it has to, like if you think about like a butt wink, right, that's the bottom portion of a squat, which is natural, right, so it has to dump kind of back and has to really open up, so you have this like pelvis that goes down, and you go and like you lower the guts into the pelvis and it has to spread out, and then to push back up it has to move back up. So if you sort of look at this limb arc, it's a way to simplify and sort of reduce the thought process of, okay, if somebody can only get to parallel, and they're probably missing the internal and external rotation in order to get down into the bottom of the squat, or like they're trying to find it somewhere else. So if they don't have full relative motions, they can't squat to depth, right? They can't get the benefit of the squat, whole thing. So for somebody like yourself, who's like a more of a narrow individual, like a skinny sort of cylinder,
Yep.
right? Like we look at, okay, like the space for internal rotation to push into the ground in the middle of a squat, like you're probably going to get stuck there. Like you're going to be able to bounce out of the bottom. You can get through like the full depth squat, okay, all the way until about a parallel position, and then at that point, that's where it's going to be hard. And like everybody's going to
Absolutely.
stick there to a certain extent, but for you, that's going to be the biggest challenge,
Yep.
right? So it's like, okay, how do we improve like your push in the middle, right? So like we can use a tempo where you can slow in that position, you can try to spend more time in that position, try to like decelerate into it, right? But then in the bottom, you're going to kind of bounce no matter what.
Yeah.
And like for you, like it's going to be one of those scenarios where like you can pause in the bottom for 1 second, 5 seconds, or 60 seconds, and it's all going to be the same outcome,
Yep.
right? So
Absolutely.
based on just like the amount of that arc, right? So like everybody has like a different arc, based on just like part of it, you got to guess and you got to take a shot at like, okay, based on how that person looks, like I think that they will behave in this manner with this exercise, right? So and that's kind of like turned out to be true just from like a structural bias, okay, which is a whole separate idea. But so we prescribe these movements where it's like you're going to sit down to the middle, right, and you're going to let your hip like fully move into a position where the pelvic inlet and the outlet are going to change, which is what has to happen in the middle, right, in order to push through the middle. So we're going to, and like that's probably like the most extreme example with like the safety bar box squat, but that is something that um, helps you move in that position, or like helps you like change the shape of your pelvis, right? So you can create more force in the middle part of your squat. And so we're going to start with that. That's going to be the most challenging, and then kind of working back from like a tempo front squat. I think we set a pause in the mid, or like a pause at parallel, or something like that, right?
Yeah.
So like those movements are going to be the most challenging, like a front squat to a box or a safety squat to a box. Whenever you have your hands in front of you, right? If we talk about that limb arc model
Yep.
of the hip, and again, it's rotations, but we put it on a 2D in order just to look at it. Where like the first sort of 60 degrees of shoulder flexion, right? You're going to have a certain rotation. In the middle, you're going to have a different internal rotation, and at the end, you're going to externally rotate. So when your hands are in this low position, right, it's much easier for you to bring your center of mass back, right? So like when my hands go low, i.e. like in a kettlebell goblet squat, right?
Yep.
If you have your forearm, or you have your arm, okay, in that lower rotation, then you can easily sit your weight back and you can find your heels. You can create a much more vertical squat. So if we look to feed those concepts, where we want you to be able to shift backward and to really find that you can feel like your glutes and hamstrings, right, and not sort of tip over, right,
Yep.
because that's not a squat anymore. If you go to like good morning a squat, it's not a squat.
Right.
So if we have your hands low like they're in the safety bar, then you can get that upper back to move backward a little bit. You find a little more space where you can stay vertical. So that's going to be the most challenging in terms of trying to feed your posterior shift so you can maintain a good vertical squat. So you can push through the middle, and then you can push out of it at the top, if that makes
Yeah, and
somewhat sense, right? It's just
you're
much easier to squat with your arms in front of your body,
yeah, because you're
right?
shifting your center of mass forward, or yeah, you're
Backward,
backward,
right? Yeah,
right?
right.
Because it
Like,
has to stay centered over your base, right? It's
correct.
got to stay in your midfoot
Well, right, yes, like if,
or
yeah,
in
so
there.
yes, like if you can center, like if you think about trying to center the holes of your body, right? You centered like the whole of your head, right? Has to
Mm-hmm.
be over the whole of your rib cage, has to be over the whole of your hips,
Mm-hmm.
right? And if you can basically center those, then you can create this really nice looking squat where you go to drop down and then push back out. When you start to see people fall forward,
Mm-hmm.
or they have to, tip into the ground, or their weight shifts back, you'll see their hips shoot
Their
back in
hips
the
shoot
squat,
back at the bottom,
right?
or
So there's all these movements where it's like, okay, that's just a compensation, and then we just need to, okay, like, why is it happening? Is that a strategy we can use? Because like, if you look at like a powerlifting squat, right, it
mm-hmm.
looks very much like you're going to be tipped over, like, and that's a strategy, and that can help you lift a ton of weight, right? Like that's a
Yeah.
good thing to do. But in our specific case, if we're trying to look at a very vertical movement, we're not going to look at that as a normal squat.
Well, and it's because it's putting more load into the hips and less in the legs, and it's not in a position where we can that translates into our Olympic lifting, right?
Right. It's like if you're looking to create a vertical position, then you need to train a vertical position, right?
Yeah.
It's like that's going to translate, right? That's going to help you achieve the positions you want, right? So like, yeah, like, so like it's not going to help that scenario. So that's why the dead stop on a box, if you fully deload, you'll feel that you can have time for your pelvic position to change, and then you can push out of there. It's the same thing that they talk about on the West Side where um, these like big heavy powerlifters, like they'll go and they'll sit on a box, right? And they're like super arched or super shoved forward. They move like a fridge. They are just extended, right? And they go to sit on this box and they let themselves rock back a little bit. And then all of a sudden they feel their hip flexors release, right? It's like how they see it, but they actually got into a position where they could like not be totally shoved forward,
Right.
and they could feel that release, and then they'll hold there. They'll let all the force sort of like dissipate, and then they'll be able to push back out, okay, with a tremendous amount of force, which is great. But the box squat can be useful. It's not just in the powerlifting sense. They use it for a different goal,
Mm-hmm.
but in this case, it's something we can do in order to help a particular issue. So it's like if somebody has a lot of trouble in the middle, right,
Mm-hmm.
then we need to pick an exercise that's going to help them push through the middle. And you may not need it forever, right? You may need it for just a little bit, just to say like, okay, this is what it should feel like. Just try to relate the variables.
Right.
So when you go back to a specific context in squatting, you know what to do. But yeah, like it's really true. So from the unconventional standpoint, it's really just looking at what is happening, right? It's like looking at the person and saying, okay, like how are they trying to achieve the task, right? And then how do I expect them to achieve the task? And then what do I need to feed them in order to help them reach the goal or to make the movement look more like it should? It's like, how do I help the squat look more like a squat? How do I help the hinge look more like a hinge, right? And like, how do I feed these movements? Like, what's the simplest thing I can do to make sure that I get what I want as a coach, right? Because like if I can say like, okay, I'm going to give you this what seemingly looks like a regressed movement, but I know that has the highest percentage to achieve the goal, then that's the one that I want to give.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's a. I'm trying to think of like another example outside of squatting. It would be like, maybe like a bench press or something like that would be, if somebody's losing it in a particular area. What's your process for kind of assessing the arc and the for assessing the movement on the human? Kind of where do you start with the person? Where do you see it break down in the movement? And how do you work through the check boxes on the decision making? I know that's a long one.
Yeah. I mean, I think just like just a like from a conversational standpoint of like if I go to give somebody a bench press, let's say, right?
Yeah.
Like there is a checklist of like as a coach, like it should, you should be able to put your arm a certain distance behind your body,
Mm-hmm.
right? It should take roughly a certain arc around your body. When I ask you about it, you should feel, your lats, you should feel your pecs, you should feel your arms,
Mm-hmm.
you should feel it. Like it shouldn't hurt in any particular area, right?
Mm-hmm.
You shouldn't have a shirt, right? So like there's this like a checklist going down of like, here is what I expect, and then if you say, oh, I don't feel that in a certain place, or if you're like, okay, so now I can start to have a conversation of like what is moving, or like what needs to change. Um, but it's really for something like a bench press, which I'm definitely not a bench specialist, that's for
No, no,
sure,
no. Well,
right?
that's kind of why I
But
picked
it's
something a
like,
little outside,
yeah, right.
so
But
we can
like,
talk about the process.
correct. But if I like, okay, like if I go back to the same thought process where it's like in a bench, I know that I'm going to maximize the gains if I can align again the holes of your body, right? The hole that comes out of your head, your rib cage, and your hips, right? So we might make sure that you are in a position where you can stack those three sort of sections of your body.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then we will do the exercise from there. So you might put feet up on a bench. You might have somebody put like plates underneath their feet in order
Mm-hmm.
just to get a better position. And they're like, okay, now I can feel my shoulders more because I put the center of my body in a better alignment where I can maximize my mobility. I can maximize the activation. So, or like for instance, like I put one where like if you add a foot contact, right? If you go to do a bench, or I think the incline dumbbell bench is one, and you like flex your hip and you put your feet on a wall, right? So now
Mm-hmm.
I've given you the foot contacts in order to better place your hip in the right position, your shoulders in the right position, so you can maintain a cylinder,
Mm-hmm.
okay, and not have a tremendous amount of like low back extension or
Yep, you don't have a
flexion,
whole
right?
lot of
Yeah,
that happening.
right. Which is a strategy to use or like to lift the maximum amount of weight, right? So like if you want to have an arch, and there's like that's a whole separate conversation. But if you want to lift the most amount of weight, right, you can shorten the range of motion. That's a strategy. But if you're just talking about just a normal person that just wants to work out, or if I want to uh, maximize the overall benefit of the exercise, right? So like in the sport of weightlifting, we may not care about bench press, but it's a good thing to do, right? It's a good thing to get your shoulder blades moving in a full range of motion. It's a good
Mm-hmm.
thing to have your arms strong, right?
Yep.
So like there's nothing wrong, like it's not going to rob your shoulder range of motion. It's one of those things now where we're looking at it as at the top of your bench, right? You can actually reach your shoulders forward, right? It's like that is more of like you can actually like protract without losing again the rib cage position. Like it's good to have full range of motion, and that's part of
Yeah.
like a overall like movement optimism, right? Is probably how I would describe it, right? So when you see somebody doing a Zercher, you're like, oh, that looks really bad for your back. It's like, well, flexion's not as bad as we thought. So there's this overall
Mm-hmm.
concept of we need a little bit of like movement optimism, right? We kind of went through this era where it's like, don't flex your spine, don't move your spine. Everything has to stay locked in. Proximal stability for distal mobility was a huge sort of like thing that was like preached, right?
Yeah.
And now we're just like, that's not life, right? It's like you need to be able to move in and out of positions. You can be able to rotate, you can be able to flex, right? Like you can maximize things. They don't have to be heavily loaded, but like it's we were kind of held hostage in a way where like all of like the core training was only planks, only side planks, pal off presses, right? There was no rotation. But if you look at just how people move, right, they need all those things to move through space. If you look at somebody being super athletic, they have all those qualities where they shift, they turn, they like all these things that happen. But now, so we're kind of like coming out of that era as like the evolution of the industry, which is great. Um, and just like little doses of that can kind of help your overall training, right? So you can just have a little bit of like a sprinkling in of like, okay, I can flex my spine with an 8 kilo kettlebell
Mm-hmm.
into a full like Jefferson curl, and that's fine. Like it's not gonna hurt my deadlift. If anything, it's gonna help my deadlift, right?
Yeah.
It's one of those things like you'll see a post, right, where it's like shout out to all the people that have like like perfect posture and their back still hurts, right? So it's like it's just not the case, right? And that's part of like the science and kind of like debunking some of the old science and trying to move forward in the industry is having a little bit of optimism. Which, if you look at the case for like a CrossFit, which is awesome, when they did like GHD sit-ups back in the day, right? It's like all of a sudden, 20 some years ago, we're like, You need to do a GHD sit up where you're going to fully bend your back and you're going to fully sit up. And then like the world, like as far as like the world I was in at the time, like strength and conditioning was like, no, that's bad. You don't want that spinal extension. You can only have so many flexion extension cycles before your back breaks, whole thing. But then you look at those people that do them and they're like, they're ripped.
You get to work the muscle most when it's most stretched. How do you stretch your abs out that far?
Correct. In sure, you can overdo your hip flexors. Like in a competitive scenario, you can like totally trash your body, all these things. But if you just go through the motion with, sound technique, whatever, right? And just like have, a graded exposure to it and not just try to do 1,000 of them in one day, then you're probably going to be okay, right? So that's where I think a little bit of like the movement optimism is, kind of went away. And it was like, this is the only way to do something. And when you kind of bury yourself in this thought process of like, these are my beliefs, right? I'm not open to anything new. This is the answer. Like it'll work for some, and sure it'll, it'll help, but it's not going to help everybody, right? And you got to be kind of fluid with your model. You got to be able to update based on new information, and to kind of rethink and rethink the system.
Well, and at the beginning you said you got to have a system. You said, principles, right?
Yeah, you're right. You got to have a principle. You got to have concepts. You got to have some like core beliefs, right? And then
a framework. You have
correct.
To have something that's
correct.
Structural that you're working off of.
Correct. And like based off that, you can kind of test like, it doesn't make sense, right? It's like you can say some things don't make sense. Like there are some things in like the knees over toes world where you're like, sure, that's a good exercise, but from a philosophy, you're just like, that tendon is not getting bathed in circulation. That doesn't make sense. Like it just doesn't pan out. It doesn't like check out, like, yeah, it can help, but like there's also lots of other things that can. So you just don't get married to one thing that's going to be the best exercise for everybody, right? Or like the number one exercise, right? And then you start getting like pigeonholed and rabbit holed into this whole world. And then when something new comes along, you're like, no, I found the answer, but it's actually not the answer. And you need to be able to update your biases and update how your model works. So that's, and like I've been stuck before, right? Right. That's the thing.
That's what I want next time is I want to know.
Yeah, it's like you get stuck in what you think is the answer. You're like, this is going to help everybody, and then it doesn't, and you got to take a step back, and you got to be able to like come back out of the rabbit hole, at a certain point, and be like, this is what we learned in school, or this is what we learned here. But like, in the 20-ish years I've been in the industry, or kind of been exposed to fitness, it's wildly changed, and like old things we did, we kind of find out we go back to some of that, and then some of the things we learned in the middle, it's like that actually turned out to be crap, and we didn't need to do as much of it as we need to. And now we have just a better way to categorize and sort of systemize the process. Wrap?
Yeah.
Great.
I gotta go pick up my kid. You got a coach?
Great. Yeah, I gotta fix. Do we have screws and a screwdriver over there?
I do.
Or sorry, not a screwdriver, but a drill.
I can bring mine in for you.
Well, is there one over there at all?
I don't think so.
Okay, got it. Okay, all right. I'll bring mine in because I didn't bring it because it was raining.